After every election, there's a great rush to declare what the real story is. More than ever, it seems that everyone wants to explain why this election proves they were right all along.
We should have said, quite simply, that any deal that comes out of this government should be put to a confirmatory referendum and that Remain should be on the ballot paper.
A message that comes to us from this is yet again, we have to get on and deliver Brexit.
Depending on who you listen to, the results of the European elections on Sunday night prove that voters want politicians to get on with Brexit, or that the strength of the Remain vote shows they want to stop it. Or perhaps, to borrow Theresa May's catchphrase, that nothing has changed. Britain remains polarised.
What we're facing from Britain's point of view is the appalling prospect of paralysis into an uncharted future.
And in the middle of all this chatter, it can be easy to forget that these were European elections with repercussions across the continent.
So a good night for the Greens.
It is a good night. It is a good night. Excellent night.
In France, Marine Le Pen again beat the French president's party.
The traditional party families will not play the same role in the future as they have done in the recent years.
You're listening to Polarised, the podcast from the RSA that's all about the forces driving us further apart and what we can do about them. I'm Matthew Taylor. This week, what can we learn from the aftermath of the European elections? Ian Leslie is away this week, so I'm joined instead by Marie Leconte, a French political journalist living in London. Marie's first book, Haven't You Heard? A Guide to Westminster Gossip, will be published in September. Welcome, Marie.
Oh, hello. Thanks for having me.
Later in this episode, we're going to talk about what the European elections mean for British politics. I'll be talking to the journalist Paul Mason, who's been controversial since those elections in the things he said about Jeremy Corbyn. But I talked to him about the threats of fascism and fatalism. And I want to talk to Marie about how the politics of Europe, and especially France, are changing. But first, in previous episodes, we've looked at how internet culture poisoned politics with the US academic Whitney Phillips.
It is so easy to close out any conversation you don't want to hear, reducing an entire human life down to a singular GIF.
We've also talked about the role of anger in our politics with Claire Fox, who is now, of course, a Brexit Party MEP.
There's nothing worse in terms of making me furious than having my motives impugned.
So it only seems right that in our full disclosure segment this week, we should talk about what it's like to be in the eye of a Twitter storm, given that you are, Marie, the instigator of what became known as Bin Raccoon Gate. So there may be just a couple of people who don't know what I'm talking about. So could you explain what Bin Raccoon Gate was?
Oh, yes, no, absolutely. I was watching the documentary called Bring the House Down on Netflix, which is kind of following 4 women trying to run for Congress in the US, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And basically there was just, and obviously she's this kind of like very, on top of being very accomplished and clearly very, very bright and successful, she is also very well put together, very glamorous, very sort of like beautiful woman. And there's a bit in the documentary that cuts to her boyfriend who was wearing, sort of like a t-shirt several sizes too big and a beard that kind of looked like it might have crumbs in it and so on. And so I kind of just took a screen grab and decided to tweet it and call him a bin raccoon.
Marie Leconte, who's a journalist, tweeted this and later deleted. Apologies for the blatantly mean tweet, but this is what AOC's boyfriend looks like. Incredible scenes truly representing all the ambitious and stunning millennial women shackled to boyfriends who look like bin raccoons out there. Okay, so can you understand why she later deleted that?
Is that your phrase, by the way, bin raccoon? Did you make that up?
So I think it's one of those, actually, as a slight side note, where I thought it was a phrase, but apparently it's not. And I think that is quite frequent.
Oh,
so
so
like
you
English
actually-
is my second language.
So it could
and
go into the, if it goes into the dictionary, it'll be yours forever.
Yes, no, I know, which is very odd
That's
because again,
amazing.
I genuinely thought that was a phrase that
Well,
existed.
congratulations on that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. But yes, I think British Twitter kind of, was a bit controversial. Some people said it was a bit mean, but that kind of died down. And then I'm not sure what happened. So I went boxing because as I do every week, and I sort of, so put my phone down for about an hour. And came back, and as far as I could tell, the entire United States of America were mad at me and telling me why. So that was slightly overwhelming, and that kind of lasted for nearly 3 days.
Right. But girl, you could have said that to your homegirl.
Yes. Right.
That did not need to go on your work account on the internet. That was mean. You knew it was mean. You said it was mean.
I think if one of your viewers calls me a bin raccoon, I'm going to stew about it for a month and a half. All right, forget it. It's fine, French journalist. Call whoever you want a bin raccoon. You're good.
Until Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez herself posted a story on Instagram of her boyfriend getting his beard trimmed and his hair cut, which I feel kind of proved that I was right to call him a bin raccoon.
You look good. Wait, give me the profile. Give me the profile.
Look at my cute little bin raccoon.
Ooh, look at that shape up.
So there's another famous viral tweet which seems kind of apt to this, and that tweet reads, "Each day on Twitter there is one main character. The goal is never to be that person." But you were that person.
I absolutely was, and I actually thought of that tweet while it was happening. It was very obvious to me that I'd become the protagonist of Twitter, which is not the thing you want. And it is actually it was a weirdly interesting experience. It was very stressful, but
That reaction, did it serve you right?
I guess. No, but I think that the interesting thing is that you see it happening, basically. There's a point at which the machine kind of starts working and there's nothing you can do. So I, after a while, deleted the tweet because I was getting really annoyed at the number of notifications I was getting, but then posted a quick thing afterwards saying, to be clear, I stand by my joke. It's just I wanted to delete the tweet to kind of calm it down. And it does not. Once Twitter has decided, again, you're the protagonist, there's nothing you can do because people had taken screen grabs of it and reposting them, etc. So there is that feeling of complete sort of helplessness when you see the avalanche and then you're just stuck in it and there's nothing you can do about it.
So the reason I'm saying, and it seems very rude because we've only just met, the reason I'm saying did it serve you right is, in a sense, if you use a phrase like that, if you put it out there, you're wanting to draw attention to what you've said. So the fact that it draws an unbelievable amount of attention, is that do you think you were treated unreasonably, I guess, is the point I want to ask.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting angles on this is the general question of tone first, as a wider point where I think quite a lot of Americans thought, that my tone was really rude, which I think that British people, as far as I could tell, had no complaints about that. But I think more broadly, and I think that's a much wider problem on the internet. And anyone who knows me or follows me on Twitter will know that's obviously a joke, because I think quite a lot of people objected to the phrase shackled to, which obviously I would never use, in a sort of serious way. But obviously if you take that tweet out of context without knowing who I am, it's probably going to sound a lot more aggressive than it was.
So, I think you're a journalist, yeah? And I have, it must have been pretty difficult being in the kind of eye of that storm and people misinterpreting it and thinking you were being mean when you were just trying to be humorous, or you were being humorous. But I guess to put the other perspective, and actually by coincidence, I was on Twitter last night sagging off a journalist because there was a piece in the Telegraph which was critical of Rory Stewart and his proposal for a citizens' assembly. And it was written by somebody who clearly had absolutely no idea what deliberative democracy was, hadn't done any research on deliberative democracy. So I'm actually very rare for me to be kind of harumphy, but I was. And I kind of said, look, this is great. This is an article about deliberative democracy by somebody who's done no research and knows nothing at all about it. And then I did another tweet saying, given that you can be commissioned to write something for the Telegraph about subjects you know nothing about, I'm going to submit an article about nuclear fusion and the phenomenology of the Vikings. Now, the thing is, what is good in a way is I could do that because I am old enough to remember that when journalists got things wrong or when they were mean, if you were lucky and you were willing to kind of write to harass the kind of editor for about 3 weeks, and you had an open and shut case, you might get an apology on page 14 of the newspaper. There was no comeback at all. So whilst I have every sympathy for what happened to you, Marie, in a way, isn't it good now that if you're a journalist and you go out there, the world can get back at you?
Yes and no. It's a topic I find quite fascinating. So, and I sort of have sympathy for all sides of the argument, which is not very helpful. But I'm busy slightly annoyed by everyone is what I mean, actually. Because on the one side, I do not buy the whole, kind of especially quite high-profile journalists saying, it's just abuse this day, we just get abuse and we can't live in these conditions, etc. When it's like, well, actually, you do choose to tweet, as you said, you choose to kind of put yourself out there. But on the other hand, you do have a side kind of, like you saying, but actually, there is a line between abuse and criticism, and surely it's good that, we can send criticism to media figures. And actually those media figures tend to fudge a bit and kind of call what is criticism abuse so they can get away with it without responding. I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. So having, obviously like the bin raccoon thing was a bit of an outlier, but I do get my fair share of kind of stuff online as a woman with opinions. And it is kind of true. I think that if you do reach a certain number of followers on Twitter or another platform, you do get quite a constant stream of abuse. And the problem is, and I think that's, and that's a perfectly human reaction, after a while you kind of tune it out. So I don't think that people are necessarily being disingenuous when they put together the kind of abuse and the criticism. It's just that after a while, if you receive enough of those tweets, they kind of merge into one in your head as well. My worry is that basically online abuse is also cheapening online criticism, because if you get enough of both, it's really, really hard for you to actually make the difference between the two, because it is actually quite a stressful experience to receive a lot of abuse.
Now we're going to move on, as promised, to talk about what happened in those European elections, from bin raccoons to Brexit. Marie, this is a hard question, but what do you think those European elections meant for British politics? We've had lots of different interpretations. What's yours?
I would say, I think actually on Brexit, not much has changed. I don't want to say nothing has changed. Too many people have said it. We knew that a lot of the population really, really like Brexit, and a lot of the population really, really don't like Brexit. That's nothing new. I think it does show the UK has become more polarised, I think. So, clearly there were lots of people voting simply along their view on Brexit, not, their policy preferences, etc. But, obviously that might be the case that it was because it was European elections specifically. Apart from that, I think the interesting narratives have been the Green Surge. The Green Surge, but especially in the context of, I think that, every time, so not talking about the Brexit party per se, but, back in the days of UKIP, there was always the kind of UKIP surge, etc. And, every election it was predicted. Sometimes it happened, sometimes it did not. And actually the Green Surge, no one really, really saw it coming. And an interesting thing about that as well, so I was kind of looking at the data this morning, is that it was not just about Brexit. So I think, the narrative already seems to be, people who voted for the Greens are basically just Labour voters who, really, really care about Brexit and want a second referendum and no Brexit at all. But actually, if you look at the reasons why people voted Green and where they voted Green, A, it was not just in the sort of very Remain supporting areas. And B, I think their main reason to vote for the Greens was for their policies on stuff that is not Brexit. So there's clearly an actual Green surge happening, which I think is really interesting. Northern Ireland as well, the fact that, so I think 57% is the figure, but at least definitely over 50% of people voted for pro-Remain parties in Northern Ireland. The EU will be a lot more interested in that going forward than to however many seats the Brexit party has got.
Also, in Northern Ireland, the Alliance got a seat, which I thought was really, if you think it's important to try to have politics that isn't entirely separated along kind of the traditional lines, that was really interesting. I mean, one of the things about the election, it seemed to me, Marie, was that Labour and the Conservatives did appallingly badly. I mean, yes, the Liberal Democrats had a better night. But across Europe, if we now stand back and look at across Europe, the death of the virtual death of parties that have been there for decades is a really big and interesting phenomenon, and it was carried on again in the European elections. So you look at parties like the SPD, which just seems to be a kind of group of old blokes now, sitting around in some kind of pub somewhere. The Labour Party in Scotland, virtually ceased to exist. What's your kind of interpretation as to the decline of these kind of major centre-right, centre-left parties, is it that they are the victims of what's going on in the modern world, or are they some ways responsible for what has happened to them?
There's clearly, that the parties have been eating themselves up from, internally for so long and have not been offering anything, any sort of exciting platform or exciting people, exciting leadership, a vision for the country. And I think, obviously in France as well, looking back at the 2017 election and then again now, the Républicains and the Parti Socialiste, no one, they're not offering anything really. There's no interesting forward-looking thinking being done by them. And so obviously, and I think there's a complacency as well, I think, of, this kind of assumption that people will keep on voting for you. And actually they won't. And, especially I think in the era of kind of the internet and social media, it is probably slightly easier, at least, for new parties to kind of launch themselves.
It is part of it that the art of winning elections and winning votes is so completely different to the art of government. And that these are parties that think of themselves as putative governments, and they have the kind of internal politics of people who think that they should be in power. And actually, what people respond to is not complex policy platforms and technical credibility or whatever. They respond to more emotional appeals to key principles that people might have. So this kind of separation of the skills of politics and the skills of government seems to me to be kind of quite problematic, really, because in a sense politics should be about both these things.
No, I agree, but and I think we kind of saw that very, very clearly. That's really the starker example with Brexit and the two main parties. Well, obviously, if you are the Brexit Party or the Lib Dems or the Greens, etc., you can just pick a side, and that's fine, and kind of try to please everyone. With the amount of MPs and supporters and activists and etc. and grandees both Labour and the Tories have, it would be impossible for them to just have a very, very sort of clear and decisive and quite sort of again, that polarised view on Brexit, because that's not how it can possibly work. So I think there's that as well, where as a smaller party you can certainly be more nimble.
And it's interesting, the Liberal Democrats, isn't it? Because in a way the Liberal Democrat revival is because people have forgotten about them being in government. The Liberal Democrats always used to do pretty well in European elections and local elections because they were an opportunity for you to vote against other parties, really. They were a kind of safe haven for people who didn't want to vote for the parties that tended to win elections. And now they've kind of returned to that. They've returned to that position. The question, of course, is what happens when these more populist parties, boutique parties, actually get into power? And I think there, again, you talked about the Greens. I think the Greens are interesting because certainly what we've seen in Germany is the Greens have managed to maintain their support even though they run quite a few, or they are involved in quite a few Länder governments. So it's interesting, this question of how it is these insurgent movements and parties manage to sustain themselves when they get into office. Because the lazy assumption was, well, it's all very well to win elections, but you won't sustain it. But whether it's Orban or Trump on the populist right, or whether it's the Greens in Germany, I think these newer movements and newer parties are learning. And one of the things I think they're learning is that you don't stop campaigning in power, is that you continue to try to maintain. Again, in Scotland, one of the things about the SNP in Scotland, they had a reasonably good night, is that although they've been running the country for a decade or more, they still have a feel of being slightly insurgent.
Completely.
So that's the trick.
Corbyn's conundrum, leave or remain.
We don't back a rerun of 2016. That happened, that's gone. What I do say is that if Parliament comes to an agreement, then it's reasonable that if Parliament wishes it, there should be a public vote on it. But that is some way off.
Of course, we're going to hear in a moment from Paul Mason. It's interesting. Paul Mason is he's not quite reached kind of bin raccoon territory, but he's getting a lot of stick right now, because he is saying that the Labour Party has moved to the left. It's got a programme. It can kind of challenge neoliberalism. But the problem is, well, you see, he's not saying the problem is Jeremy Corbyn, and that's a step too far. But he's saying the problem is the people around Jeremy Corbyn, which I think he means. But I also wonder whether it's slightly code for Jeremy Corbyn himself when you can't actually say Jeremy Corbyn. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting, that dynamic in the Labour Party, it seems to me. I mean, I did a thing for Channel 4 a couple of weeks ago, and I said on it, it seems to me there is a consensus towards a more left-wing platform in the Labour Party. But the problem is Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him. And I thought the response I'd get to that from kind of being a Blairite in my background was kind of critiquing me for the fact that I seemed to be reasonably positive about the Labour Party moving to the left. Actually, that wasn't the response I got at all. The response I got was from kind of Corbynites who said, how dare you criticise the leader. So it's going to be interesting to see how this Labour Party thing plays out, actually.
But also, isn't it, I swear I remember around the same time of Miliband's leadership for the Labour Party, the kind of, Miliband's fine, but it's the people around him who are the problem in sort of like circa 2014. So I think that's also a thing that always comes back round. The sort of, it's not like, especially weirdly, I think, with Labour. But actually, that being said, we had it with Theresa May as well. Like it's kind of one of those stories that every few years, kind of ticks along and it's that, well, actually, there are X, Y, and Z problems, but it's not quite the leader, it's just the people around them, which, and I'm never quite sure if it's true or not. I think in some cases it is, in some cases it's not. But in any case, surely, any leader that can be entirely swayed by their advisors probably is not a very good leader.
Well, we'll come back to a couple of those themes in a moment, but let's first of all have a slight shift of gear and hear from Paul Mason. He came to the RSA to talk about his book, Clear, Bright Future. Now, not everyone will see things the way that Paul does, but what was interesting to me was that his views were very much preoccupied by the thought that the far right is on the rise and still on the rise. One of the things that was interesting in the book is that a lot of the books I read around the kind of crisis of liberal democracy or Trump or Brexit or whatever try very hard to be sympathetic to the people who voted for Trump. They try very hard to be sympathetic to the people who will vote Brexit today. And people will vote Brexit for various reasons. I'm not lumping them all together. But those who will vote Brexit because they really think Nigel Farage is great. You're not really in the business of doing that. I mean, you're quite hostile to them. And I think see them as people who... I'm kind of interested. Do you see them as people who realise their interests are being threatened and therefore fighting back? Do you see them as people who are suffering false consciousness? What is your description of those people who are going to vote Brexit today?
Well, first of all, to not lump them all together, and certainly not to try to unnecessarily otherize them. But it is a culture war, and in a culture war, of course, what you aim to, like all wars, you aim to disorganize the opposition. So yes, I want to give certain things to people who might vote for the Brexit Party or the Conservative ultra-Brexiteers in order to prevent them from becoming fascists. And ultimately, what's the end of the journey? It's Utøya in Norway. It's what happened in Christchurch. It's the same thought architecture, unfortunately, is becoming more and more shared between quite mainstream right-wing thought and the guys who write the manifestos and then kill people. Now, what I want to try and bring back as many of those people as possible towards is the idea of the institutions, and they're not very left-wing institutions. Bourgeois democracy, universal human rights, and the rule of law. Many leftists have kind of criticised this by saying, what do you mean the rule of law? What do you mean the Universal Declaration with all its Western bullshit? Yes, for me, because that's the important thing right now in history to defend. You remember the Jules Rimet trophy, what was it called? The World Cup. If you won it 3 times, you kept it. Brazil won it 3 times and they kept the trophy. If we defeat fascism twice in 100 years, we'll be able to keep democracy. Because we've got a very highly educated, in the West anyway, in the developed world, population. And I think we do. There are grounds for thinking, if we defeat it again, we can actually move to a higher level in which it's much harder for it to come back.
One of the things that Paul talked about at our event, and indeed writes about in Clear, Bright Future, is fatalism. He sees a big part of what's going wrong as the encouragement of a fatalistic view about humanity. He sees fatalism also as being part of what drives people towards the politics of the far right. We're very grateful you stayed behind for just a few minutes to talk to us for material we will use in our series Polarised. So that leads me to my first question, which is, one of the things I loved about the book, and it's been a theme for us in Polarised, has been to try to link the big political, social, economic arguments to a deeper crisis, in an almost a kind of existential crisis, you might say, that in a sense we don't know how to live. People do not know how to live, how to make their lives work in a quite a deep. There are all sorts of specific things, not have enough money and credit and all that, but there's a deeper. How do I live in this world going on? And you talk about that in the book.
Well, look, I think that neoliberalism eviscerated the 360-degree self of many people. It reduced them to two-dimensionality. Marcuse writes of a one-dimensional man, but the real loss of a dimension, I think, wasn't in the consumerist 60s. It was at the point where we all started to become economic calculators of asset worth. The mores of financial life percolated through to us, and we reduced ourselves to sort of assets. Human capital, you could say. That in turn leaves us disarmed, I argue in the book, against both the anti-humanism of the far right and the implicit anti-humanism of the technological control industry, which, Google's ethics board just blew up. Right? Google just had to sack its entire ethics board because they suddenly realized that what you need is a moral philosophy, not a set of sort of bullet points derived from previous ethical systems. If you're going to design an artificial intelligence, you need to give it a theory of human beings, and they realized they hadn't got one. Now, the threats are as diverse as a new biological hierarchism, which says men are better than women, whites better than blacks, and a new technological hierarchism that looks at human beings and says, eventually in the middle of the century, I think a machine will ask a human being, look, mate, I've rigged the last 20 elections in this country. On what basis do you claim the right to vote? Full stop. This is no longer pure sci-fi dystopia. I think we see the beginnings of it in the attitude of these hugely powerful captains of the tech industry to human beings themselves. They're users. They're users. They're not even clients. They're not even customers. They are users. Has a very weird connotation for me, obviously of drug use, but also of you use what I allow you to use, and while I use you in a way. So yeah, for me, the humanism part is a defense against both the political and the technological threats we face.
If we had enough time, I would love to have a conversation with you just about fatalism.
Yeah.
I think fatalism is an inherent and important part of the human condition. And you talk about religion a bit in your book. And I think that religion helped us with fatalism, because on the one hand, religion says fatalism is okay. It's all right to feel fatalistic. That's fine. You don't need to panic with it. Capitalism doesn't really want you to feel an existential fatalism. I mean, you might argue that there is a kind of fatalism implicit in the kind of neoliberal ideology. And also religion says to you, and it's okay to be fatalist about the human condition because there's something better. I don't mean a kind of crude notion of heaven, but there's something beyond this which makes it bearable. So for me, we have to learn to live with and accept fatalism, and I don't know how you do that without religion. For you, fatalism is entirely a kind of negative thing. Are we talking about different things?
Well, I think in a way we might be, because for me, if you allow yourself an element of fatalism, then from a Marxist point of view, all you're saying is men make history, but, and then the but and the comma, but not in conditions of their own choosing. That second half of the sentence is the justification for fatalism. What I've observed, especially once those with agency, that is the working class, were defeated and atomized, that their belief in agency declined. And when we go to the streets of small towns where far-right and nationalist voting is strong, anywhere in Europe, I think you find rising fatalism. There is even some kind of Pew Attitude Survey evidence that shows fatalism is rising. But I think in our discussion, somebody asked me what's the definition of the human being. Well, one part of the definition is it's the energy against the entropy. It's the action. It's the purposive action in defiance of all the other determining forces. The human being is able to choose, to a certain extent, limited by history, a series of actions in a way that the silverback gorilla or the dolphin is not. And for me, that is what makes us human. It's having an element of agency. And free will versus determinism for me is not a given concept. It's historically achieved. I think, a 14th century peasant in France has less free will than the woman outside on the Strand here in London with her cell phone and her rights and her achieved rights and her attitudes towards herself. She has more free will and certainly more agency. So for me, human history is the struggle for free will, the possibility of free will. And the more free will we achieve, the less fatalistic I think we're going to be.
When you talk about fatalism, distinguish between a kind of healthy, necessary part of the human condition, fatalism, and a kind of pessimism about human possibility, which I think is different.
Yeah, I think for me, fatalism, it's certainly the latter. It's the idea that nothing I can do will ever make me rich unless I win the X Factor or become a Premiership footballer.
Right, so it's about agency, fundamentally.
Yeah, so many teenage people you meet believe exactly this, that they will only ever be successful by accident if fate points the finger at them, almost literally through the lottery, points. No, I don't think the generation of working class people I grew up with had that level of fatalism. They all believed, because they'd experienced rising wages and in-life social mobility in their lifetime.
And the capacity for resistance as well.
Yeah, their fathers and mothers had the capacity to resistance. That post-war generation, that was my dad's generation, were experiencing real rise in agency. I mean, literally in the ability to go to foreign countries, to read books that weren't allowed to read before, to have sexual relationships that weren't slightly more free than they were before. But my granddad's generation, I think, almost like they probably felt compelled by history to resist fascism. Like, I think they almost did have a fatalism. We have to, it's them or us. We've got to fight them. So one of the really interesting things for me as somebody emerging from the Marxist movement is the extent to which Marxism never really wanted to tell the history of the proletariat. For me, the history of my family is a history of move from helplessness to agency. It certainly is. And the post-war Labour government creates the ability to do that. For the classic orthodox Marxist, the proletariat is just the proletariat all the way through. And if it occasionally kind of puts on a Teddy Boy suit or a mod jacket, it's just wasting its time, because it should really be the dumb agent of history. And my break from that kind of Marxism consists precisely of saying it was never the dumb agent of history. In fact, Karl Marx in Paris in 1842 is seeking Etienne Cabet, a self-educated, shoemaker who wants to take everybody to Illinois to set up a commune. These weren't dumb people. They were highly intelligent and self-educated people with incredible sense of agency. And it's the later Marxist, and Marx himself, I think, lapses into it. The later theory of the proletariat as the dumb agent of history is the biggest negative legacy that people like me are struggling with.
Great. Paul, thank you very much. So, Marie, coming off the back of that conversation I had with Paul, we talked a bit about the Greens. The kind of general reaction to the European elections was a sense of some relief. It wasn't broadly across Europe a massively great night for the kind of nationalist right. It was an all right night for them. If you go back 20 years, we'd have thought the results were terrifying, but given what we've come to expect. Thinking about France in particular, so the National Front won, but only by a tiny
by 1 point
bit
over, En Marche.
I'm kind of interested, who do you think is a kind of typical National Front voter? And what are they voting about? And is it primarily a kind of fatalistic, nostalgic kind of we wish the world would go away and we could go back to something that used to exist? Or is there more of a kind of programme for the future?
Yes and no. I think they've managed to form quite an interesting electoral coalition. There was, I'm trying to think, I can't remember where it was, but there was a really good piece, I think, in The Atlantic, of all places, a few years ago on the kind of new European far right. And I think that the National Front, obviously I followed their European elections campaign a bit less closely than I did with the one in 2017, but that one, was very much, it's not UKIP, it's not the kind of, whatever the French equivalent is of the kind of like Little England, etc. It's nearly this quite open view of saying, okay, well, we love the beautiful sort of like French Republic. We're going to do great things together, etc., etc. But in order to do that, we need to get rid of the more illiberal people in our society. So, one of the National Front things could be, we're totally fine with gay people, but who's not fine with gay people? All the Muslims here because of their religion. They don't want you to be gay and be like happy and free in the Republic, etc. And actually, that message I think has worked quite well. So if I remember correctly, in the last European elections, something incredible, I think like about a third of gay couples or something had voted for the National Front, which was really interesting. So I think it's not, they've been quite clever in not being entirely sort of like backwards looking. So I don't, I'm not sure there's entirely like a typical National Front voter. Obviously, a lot of it will be about class. I think, overwhelmingly the support for the National Front is what like comes from the working class and comes from really deprived areas as well. So kind of, like around the north, like there's slightly like ironically a bit of a crescent shaped to the National Front voting pattern. So I think it's kind of the north, bits of the east where basically nothing happens, and sort of like bits of the south. So
and how much does that mirror the Gilets jaunes bases of power? That because they are kind of a phenomenon of the periphery as well, aren't they?
They are. I don't think. So I think the Gilets jaunes, the entire point was that they were kind of everywhere. Like even so, like my hometown is not, which is, I think the easiest and quickest way to explain not is that it's basically the French Bristol. So, sort of like very wide, very middle class, has always kind of, I think, been left wing, like, sort of like centre left, quite wet, etc. And we had lots of Gilets jaunes as well. I think, the entire point of the Gilets jaunes was that they were absolutely everywhere. If you look beyond geography as well, just in terms of what they support, maybe the current ones, now it's a much, much smaller group of people are more likely to be kind of like far-right populists, etc. But at the very beginning, at the kind of height of the Gilets jaunes, that they were completely all over the place because there was no central movement. It was created via like local Facebook groups. And then kind of, ignited all at the same time. But essentially, you had some Gilets jaunes groups which were far left, others far right, others all over the place, others, just apolitical entirely. Like the foreign perspective does seem to be that it was overwhelmingly kind of like populist far-right people protesting. But actually, when you look at the proper reporting in the French media, a lot of them were just all over the political spectrum, really. Like not quite, there were a few centrists there, but generally, yeah, like apolitical, far-left, far-right, etc. Like it was kind of everyone.
So just to finish with, I'm kind of interested as to where we think you and I this is going to go next. So it's really hard to see, and there are big differences from country to country. And even if you want to use a phrase like the far right is very different. Brexit is different from the National Front, and etc. I guess the only kind of way I can try to put this together is that in the end, I think that despite the relative success of Orban and Trump and Erdogan in Turkey, I still think ultimately governments have got to be kind of rational, and they've got to be competent, and they've probably got to try to appeal to most people in the country. But maybe what it is now is that in the old days, what you did was you would have a party that would be in the centre and would win votes in the centre and say that's because we will govern from the centre. Now, in a sense, what happens is a kind of seesaw politics, which is that there's nobody actually sitting in the centre. There's people, the parties are sitting at the extremes. But yet, in the end, what somehow emerges from that has to be a government that can actually run the country. That you can't run the country on the basis of the kind of single issue or anger or nostalgia of tribalism, which seems to be winning votes. So kind of government stumbles on, but in a politics that is polarised.
I would actually question your premise, I think.
Good.
No, but I think, there's certainly, especially in the UK and to an extent in France, been a few decades of, mostly kind of, centre-left governments and then centre-right and then back again, etc. Yeah. But that was not always the case. When you look back, obviously Thatcher being the very, very obvious example, or even, the kind of post-war Labour governments, etc. Like that, it was not always the case that government switch, from a sort of like gentle centre-left to a gentle centre-right. It was, I think, politics did used to be more polarised, and I think, France is exactly the same. We've had some very left-wing presidents, we've had some like really reasonably sort of like right-wing governments as well. So I think it might just be that shift again. So perhaps it is the case that actually the blip was the kind of, soft centre being shifted around every 4 or 5 years, and now we're just back to our normal state of there's the left and the right.
Yeah, I suppose so, but I think you're right when it comes to politics, in the sense that I don't see those kind of centrist parties having a route back. I mean, some of them are still doing okay, and Macron did okay. But as I say, I still think that to run the country in a kind of globalized context where you can't go on your own, there's a limit to how radical you can be, as President Mitterrand found out many, many, many years ago when he came in with a kind of socialism in one country agenda and had to abandon it within a couple of years. So as I say, I think we're going to live in this world where the appeal of parties is more to our emotions and our gut instincts, and there's more of a kind of niche offer. But yet somehow, after the dust has settled, whoever is in power has got to try to run the country, and that ends up being a more technocratic and more centrist exercise.
That'd be quite an amusing, I think, reversal of the way at least Britain has done things over the past of few years, of kind of normally pitching to the centre and then going back to the left or to the right, depending on which party you were from. And now it might well be a case of kind of pitching to the left, pitching to the right, and then drifting back to the centre.
Final question. Who's going to win the Tory leadership campaign, Marie?
Oh, no. Okay, I'm no longer in the business of making predictions because I have called everything wrong in a long time. The 2017 election, I was wrong, but I was not as wrong as most people, which is a very long way to say I have absolutely no idea. I want to say I don't think Boris will get it, but I have no idea how much of that is my sort of political expertise and saying that, the front runner never wins, etc., or he doesn't really have a constituency among the Parliamentary Conservative Party. And how much of it is I just really don't want it to happen. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the problem with predictions where, I'd just be more likely to actually reveal myself slightly in saying who I think will win when it's actually probably who I'd rather won. So I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah, I will put my neck out, and I think Boris will win. It seems to me there's lots and lots of candidates, but what you basically got is you've got Boris, and then you've got 10 anti-Boris candidates. And in a way that's a problem for Boris because everyone who's interviewed, the subtext is I'm not Boris. And so there's a lot of anti-Boris stuff because people are partly promoting themselves but partly trying to stick their boot into Boris. In the end, though, I think the problem is for the Conservatives that they have a very narrow base, and in some ways it is a democratic outrage that the next Prime Minister will be chosen by a party with the average age of kind of 65 of, overwhelmingly white elderly people in the south of England. But they kind of know they've got to find some way of reaching out beyond their base. And in the end, whatever you might think of Boris, I might think of Boris, he does reach out beyond the Conservative base. He won London twice, and London is not a Conservative city. So I think he will buck the trend of the Conservative Party that the favourite never wins. But, we will see.
But I think that's why the original debate, I think Emily Maitlis with all the potential candidates is going to be quite good because that will show, I think, Conservative MPs, so obviously the first kind of electoral college there, who actually appeals to real people. So I think, that debate has been criticised a bit because obviously people then get to vote afterwards. I think it's quite a good idea to show, actually who works well on telly, who doesn't, who do people like, who don't people like. Maybe Conservative MPs will, act rationally for once. Probably won't, but...
And if Boris does win, the big question, which relates to all we've been talking about in this episode, is will he, as some people say, if he wins, move a bit more to the centre, become a bit more statesperson-like, be a bit more inclusive, try to find a way in the end through Brexit, maybe even allow a second referendum, with the choice being a kind of hard Brexit versus Remain? Or will he adopt the kind of populist playbook? Will he, if he's in power, say, actually, some of the most effective and popular leaders are the ones who've stayed populist in power, and that's what I'm going to do, and there will be a hard exit, and, if it's tough for Britain, that doesn't mind, because that doesn't matter, because that'll play to my kind of Churchillian instincts. So that's something that if he wins, we'll be discussing on a future programme. Marie, it's been fantastic to have you on the programme. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Polarised. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tell someone about it. And we really appreciate it if you left us a rating or a review in your podcast app. Polarised was presented by me, Matthew Taylor. Thanks to my guests this week, Marie Leconte. The producer was James Shield, and we were brought to you by the RSA.